Greetings anachronistic Batman t-shirts and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Before we get to the video proper, we've got just a tiny Snipe and Whip history lesson. Don't worry, it won't take very long.
Back in 2017, to tie into the release of Warhammer 40,000 8th edition, we put out a video called 10 Weird and Wonderful Things from Rogue Trader, that detailed a handful of the oddities from the first edition of 40k, from its bizarre lore to its convoluted rules, all in a nice numbered list, since, well, YouTube loves nice numbered lists. This video did incredibly well. To this day it is our second most viewed video, so we made a second one which also did pretty well, and would eventually lead to us getting the idea for Codex Compliant as a series, and forever doom us to an eternity of reading obsolete rulebooks. Basically, you can consider those two videos to be Codex Compliant episodes 0 and 0.1.
But the thing about Rogue Trader is that because they were throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, there's always more stuff to talk about. So now that Warhammer 40,000 9th edition is upon us, we thought it might be fun to finally make a third weird and wonderful instalment and integrate it into the series it inspired. After all, the best things in life come in threes, except of course for those things that do not. Regardless, let's once again look at 10 weird and wonderful things from Rogue Trader.
We've mentioned in previous videos that Chaos wasn't in the original Rogue Trader rulebook, but do you know what was? The Eye of Terror.
Yeah, despite the powers of Chaos not yet being a thing, the Eye of Terror was. Although it's less of a hole where reality was torn asunder by the birth of Slaanesh, and more of just a really persistent warp storm that most of the time prevents travel to the planets within it. One of these lost worlds is highlighted in here, a planet known as Logan's World, and more specifically it talks about the largest settlement, Hell's Reach. No relation to the Hell's Reach of Armageddon /novel /YouTube series fame, it's just GW has to reuse names constantly or the wizard gets angry. Logan's World is described thusly.
Upon its barren and waterless surface live men and orcs, often fighting, sometimes trading, at times even cooperating to overcome the hostile environment.
So Hell's Reach itself can probably be best described as Mos Eisley via Mad Max. We're shown an anarchic world of gangs, slavers, bus drivers and mercenaries, where orcs and mankind coexist. Kinda, sorta, with the Imperium only able to access it briefly every 4 to 10 years, ruining everyone's fun like the narcs they are. The whole thing is really just an example of a place where you can throw out the usual rules of the setting and just have fun with it. And it's a far cry from the hellish demon worlds you'll find in the Eye of Terror today. Also, Batman t-shirts still exist in the 41st millennium, although we personally choose to believe it's simply branded Conrad Kurz merch. And bonus points go to any of you who make a Necromunda gang based on the Hell's Reach street punks, especially if they have authentic sniffin' glue tops and appropriately gargantuan pompadours.
There is a question that many 40k fans have asked over the years, a question of great importance to the setting, its philosophy and even its future. That question is, do orcs Of course, nowadays we know they don't need to, they reproduce via spores as part of the whole orcoid ecosystem. But before that, back in the first edition rulebook, there were a few lines of text that imply something different.
Gretchens are a smaller breed of orc, but are otherwise very similar. They share the same general skin tones, physical characteristics, and psychological traits as their larger cousins. It is likely that the two races evolved on a common world from the same distant ancestor, and they can interbreed to produce intermediate types.
So while it doesn't talk about orc reproduction in detail, and the fact that there is more to sensual cuddling than reproduction, the fact it states that orcs and grots can have the babies does imply that they reproduce sexually. A logistical nightmare for their modern counterparts, but back then they weren't actually that much different in size. It also implies that orcs can do the nasty in War the Orcs, saying that orcs develop the ability to breed when they become feral orcs, with half of them gaining marsupial-like pouches. But it's so vague on details, you could easily read it as being a purely asexual reproduction thing too. So the answer to the question is, yes. I mean, probably. In Rogue Trader. Also, in the section concerning Gretchen, it states that their uniforms are often decorated with, trophies?
Scalping is common, teeth necklaces are prized, and the sexual organs of some aliens hold a peculiar fascination for these creatures.
So, if you think you've had a bad day, spare a thought for the Rogue Trader era guardsman who had to deal with a grot running towards him covered in various alien dongers.
From time to time, Games Workshop release special edition models, often to celebrate some milestone for the company or a holiday or what have you. One such time was in late 1987 when the world was graced with the beauty that was Christmas Marines. Shown in White Dwarf 96, these Marines don't actually have that much Christmassy about them beyond their paint job if we're honest. In fact, the Christmas tree on the pauldron there is actually just an arrow painted differently. This is possibly because they were also sold as spaced out Marines as shown in the Citadel Winter 87 mail order catalogue. Are we suggesting that Games Workshop may have just repackaged some inebriated looking Marines as a special Christmas purchase simply by giving the example models a festive paint job?
Of course not. We wouldn't dream of suggesting such a thing.
Hey, did you know that rogue trader dreadnoughts could fly? Sorry, kinda getting ahead of myself there. I just like my dreadnoughts is all. This is a dreadnought respecting house. Anyway, in White Dwarf 100 there was a great expansion of the dreadnought rules and lore from the main rulebook. We're shown 3 Imperial Dread classes, those being the Contemptor, Doredio, and Furibundus, also known by their codenames Chuck, Eddie, and Fury. Since this is Rogue Trader GW, we checked to see if this was a reference to something, but I mean, unless it's a reference to Chuck Eddy the music journalist, or Chuck and Eddie's quality used auto parts of Connecticut, then we have no idea what it could be. Oh, and when I said Imperial Dreads earlier, that wasn't me just being vague. It's because they weren't just for Space Marines, like Rhinos and Land Raiders, the Imperial Guard could have dreadnoughts too.
They also had a range of special melee attacks, like treading on people, bear hugging them, or headbutting. Although height restrictions apply to which of these attacks can be used against which units, I suppose a dreadnought would put their back out trying to headbutt a squat after all. But to get onto the flying thing, yeah, that was just a thing dreadnoughts could do. And it wasn't like now where that's really only the purview of Blood Angels. Dreadnoughts, be they Imperial, Orc or Eldar, could just buy a jump pack that would be fitted into their feet for 10 points. I suppose technically it's a powered jump rather than full flight, but the distinction would feel pretty arbitrary if you gazed over to see a flock of Contemptors on their way to cause mischief.
One thing that can be a little surprising when looking at first edition troop stat lines is how familiar they are. With the exception of Initiative, which disappeared with the coming of 8th edition, their fighting characteristic stats are all in the game now. Where it really deviates is in their personal characteristics. In the modern game, this is broadly speaking represented by a model's leadership value, but back then it was split into 4 different stats. Leadership, representing their innate sense of discipline and obedience. Intelligence, how smart what they are and if they are able to do a technology good. Cool, reflecting their temperament and ability to keep calm under pressure. And willpower, which is their ability to fend off things like psychic attacks.
How did these manifest in the game? Well, for example, leadership was used in a very similar way to which it always has been, to manage falling back. If you didn't have a high enough intelligence, then you couldn't use certain high-tech weapons, and failing a test on cool meant that a character would become confused, frenzied, afeared, or full of hatred. And as you would expect, willpower was used when attempting to stop a psychic attack. You can see why they decided to do away with everything but leadership as the game became more focused on larger battles, as this level of detail wasn't necessary. But the nuance did mean that it was possible to, say, have smart characters who were obedient but would panic easily, or disciplined and composed characters who were simply too thick to hold a gun by the right end.
That right there is a Space Marine with a Shuriken catapult. Yeah, that's it for number 6. For a long time, Imperial Robots were absent from 40k, coming back into vogue with the release of the Mechanicus faction a few years back. But robots were in the game right from the start, and in White Dwarf 104, they, like the Dreadnoughts we mentioned earlier, received a massive overhaul, even adding a whole robot phase to the game. Also, all the robots' names begin with a C for some reason. But anyway, the part we want to mention is that you didn't just play these like regular units, they had to be programmed. With the article came a series of tokens that you could photocopy and arrange into programs for your robot to follow. I tried to get Wib to explain this since he did a computer programming course at college, but he took one look at this, said never again, and left the flat, refusing to return until it was over. Basically, the idea is that you tried to follow the program you created as best you could in your turn. So for example, in this program, your robot looks for its target. If it finds it, then it goes to C, and if it's in range, then it fires. If a target isn't present, then it'll attempt to find a new one. Or this take and hold program, where it will attempt to move towards an objective and defend it from any enemy there. It requires a lot of work to do even simple actions like this, and accidentally knocking into someone's program would probably result in a fistfight. However, I imagine it was very satisfying when you were able to take all these tiles and fashion an efficient routine out of them, at least for a very specific type of player.
Figuring out the capacity of transports in 40k tends to be a pretty simple affair. They have a clear capacity, some transports can only carry certain units, and some units fill up more than one capacity slot. However, if we go back to White Dwarf 128, then the Orc Battle Wagon has some interesting rules in that area. Basically, its transport capacity was however many orcs you can fit on there without them falling off, which is A, just great, and B, makes me curious how many you could actually fit on there. Sadly, we don't have an era-appropriate battle wagon, so a modern one will have to do.
Okay, I've got my battle wagon, got my stack of orcs. Let's try it. Okay, just putting them on any flat surface, I can get 10 on there. But the rules don't say anything against stacking. That is 33 orcs. Not entirely sure that this is what they intended, but, well, I did it.
In early Rogue Trader, the background of the various factions was often quite different to today, and the most well-known of the Space Marine chapters is no exception. In the same White Dwarf 97 article that contained Ilian Nastase, the half-Eldar librarian, we also got a brief rundown of the history of the Ultramarines. In this, they were formed during the interlegionary wars of the 32nd millennium, which makes them a chapter of the Third Founding. Rather than being the 13th original Legion, they were given the number by the Emperor since the first 13th Legion turned traitor and was subsequently banished into the Eye of Terror. The Ultramarines gained the old Traitor Legion's number, rituals, paraphernalia of indoctrination, which, by the way, would be a great name for an acid jazz band, as well as their implant zygotes and, gene sperm?
Quickly, brother, we must harvest the gene sperm.
We gotta find a better name for that.
Rabute Gilliman is mentioned, but like many characters who would later become the Primarchs, was just a regular Marine who founded the chapter, and is 100% definitely dead in this version, unless he can heal from being nothing but bones. However, they are still based on Macragge. Marnius Calgar is chapter master, and they have a thing for fighting Tyranids. So the core of their more modern interpretation is there, it's just covered in a fine mist of gene sperm.
If it helps, I don't feel good about that line either.
Finally, one thing we were asked when we made those original videos was, why is it called Rogue Trader anyway? Because despite Rogue Traders having rules in the game, they're no more important than anything else really. It might as well be called Warhammer 40,000 Inquisitor, or Warhammer 40,000 Vehicle Turn Radius Ratio.
However, in White Dwarf issue 94, its author, Rick Priestley, wrote an article talking about the creation of the game that explains it. Around 1982, the game was envisioned as a small thing to be given away for free to mail-order customers, part of a series of freebie games in fact. The first one of these games in development ballooned in scope and eventually became Warhammer Fantasy, establishing the format that GW's games would take on from that point. In 1983, we saw a small preview of the game that would become 40k, simply called Rogue Trader, which made sense since trading was like an actual part of the game at that point.
In December of 1986, after years of development and a few rewrites radically changing the focus of the game, Rogue Trader was ready to enter the editing process, but by then GW had decided to produce a game based on the 2000 AD comic Rogue Trooper, which I've never read but is apparently about a large blue man. Since releasing two completely unrelated games called Rogue Trader and Rogue Trooper in the same year would be unnecessarily confusing, a new name was needed. As Priestley himself puts it,
"Some bright spark, whom I shall hate for the rest of my life, came up with Warhammer 40k. Because of the ensuing confusion over Warhammer Battle, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and Warhammer 40k, the full title is Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader."
So 40k only has the Warhammer name at all to avoid confusion with the licensed game they were producing at the time, and 1st edition only has the name Rogue Trader because that replacement name also caused confusion since they had too many games called Warhammer. Can't help but think there was an easier way around that one, lads.
Although this article also reveals that Priestley's preferred way of abbreviating the game's name was Warty Thou, which, personally speaking, I think that we should bring back out of respect for its creator.
So that was 10 more curiosities from the grim dark past. We hope you found it entertaining. Although we do have something to ask of you. While we've obviously consumed a lot of Rogue Trader era stuff, we were literal babies at the time of its release. So we were never really able to experience the game when that's all there was to 40k. Our perspective is always going to be informed by the editions released later that we have much more experience with.
So if you do happen to be one of the people that played Rogue Trader back in the day, then please leave us a comment about your fondest memory from the game, and we encourage the rest of you to go and check out what those people wrote. That's not just a cheeky way of enticing engagement on this video, although I suppose it is that as well. But really, we just don't want the only perspective on the game you see to be from two weirdos who happen to be nostalgic for other people's youths.
But for now, if you'll excuse us, we have a new edition of Warty Thou to read through.
It's really awkward to try and read when you're sitting there looking at us like that.